Thank you, Rich.
Ready to roll?
Yeah, ready to roll. Okay. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all for coming out in the snow. uh, so, I'm going to talk about that. I want to spend some time trying to, when Tony and I and lots of other colleagues, many people here, talk about why we've been doing this work for, as Rich said, a long time. One of the things that, maybe the thing that's topic A, is that we have a profound belief that the scholarship, professional practice of education can profoundly impact people's lives for the better, especially people who have been disadvantaged by our system. And so, when we think about why we and our colleagues have been engaged in this sort of improvement science journey for, I don't know, explicitly maybe for the last 8 or 9 years. The reason, first and foremost, that we do it is that. And sometimes when we talk to colleagues about this work, it's sometimes surprising that it's not patently obvious that's why we do it. And so because of that, I thought that it would be an interesting exercise to, in this context, be just a little bit more explicit about why worrying about a science of improvement is connected to issues of equity and social justice. And so to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit, very little, about the American story. Inside our story, baked in almost, is a story about education and its power and mobility. Those of you who know me, I cannot resist typos. I swear I can't. And so I want to talk a little bit about why science of improvement might be useful in thinking in this pursuit of social justice. I want to give some examples, some of which from our work and some from other people's work. And then I'm going to try to sum it up, trying to drive this argument home that a science of improvement is deeply coupled to issues of social justice and equity. So when I was growing up, if I was told one time, I was told 1,000 times that the reason to go to school is to make my life better and the lives of people who come after me better. How many of you heard that story in your homes? I mean, that's the story. I was listening to a talk the other day, and this scholar was talking about the fact that the reason we have to get kids en masse to graduate from high school effectively and to go to college is that, that's the new floor for having a good life in the United States. So the mythic power of education is sort of baked into us as a people. I mean, James Madison said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. That great American philosopher, Tom Brokaw, said, there's a place in America to take a stand. It is public education. It is the underpinning of our cultural and political system. It is the great common ground. Public education, after all, is the engine that moves us as a society toward a common destiny. It is in public education that the American dream begins to take shape. Sounds like what you heard when you were growing up, right? That's what I heard. And we all hear these stories about how education influences on our mobility. Frederick Douglass said, to educate a man is to make him unfit to be a slave. Bill Janklow, who you may remember was a governor of Idaho, talked about this marvelous program, South Dakota, sorry Bill, this marvelous program they had there, sort of statewide supported internships to help young people understand how business operates and to learn in practical settings. And he talked about, in this quote, how those things were really great mobility assets for his state when he was governor. But David Frum, whom some of you may remember, was, I think, one of Bush II's speechwriters, great guy, said, if you go on TV and say there's no other country in the world where you can be born poor and become rich, you get a huge megaphone. If you tell the truth, which is that most studies show actually that the United States is worse than anybody except maybe Great Britain in upward mobility, there's no audience for you. So there's a massive disconnect between what Janklow said and what Frum wrote. And there's a sense in which both are true. Both are true. And our task is to make this way more true than this. But it's hard. W. Edwards Deming, who was essentially the father of the quality improvement in the world, said of our field, education is miracle goals without methods. He, when he said it, was talking about Goals 2000. He could have said it about NCLB. He might have, if he were still alive, he might say it about the Common Core. This is part of a long history, I think, of inequitable access to innovation. Some of you may remember Shirley Bryce Heath's classic work, Ways with Words, and the subsequent practical innovations that grew out of it, like having lots and lots of books in pediatricians' offices so moms could learn to read to their kids because of the power of doing that. And what investigators found was that there was a profound difference between the way advantaged moms and disadvantaged moms used these tools to read their children. More recently, my colleague at UCLA, Jane Margolis, wrote a marvelous book called Stuck in the Shaolin. And the message of Stuck in the Shaolin is that all these rich computer resources that are part of schooling today are used very, very differently in advantaged context and disadvantaged context. And a similar story is trumpeted in Mark Warshauer's book, Laptops and Literacy, where he really essentially, with few exceptions, traces from north to south, disadvantage to advantage, because in Maine, where this work was done, the closer you get to Boston, the more advantaged communities you find. And what he found was that these laptops the state spent a huge amount of money on were used more effectively as you went that way. So we as a field and as a community have many stories like this where you have some lighthouse innovation that we are convinced will change the world. And what we see is great variation in its take-up. It's because when you invent a thing like this box, most of us think that our box is just great, and everybody should have the same box. In reality, we probably ought to be spending time to figure out exactly how to implement our box such that it serves the most people. Another way to think about that is in all complex systems, you're going to find huge variation. And often, when you find this variation, some of us perform well in those systems and others of us do not. The goal of our work and of quality improvement is to create excellent outcomes for all people, to lop off this part of the distribution and make advantage in this part of the distribution much more equitably distributed. But we have an aspiration chasm where you have some promising intervention. We have this goal of the promising intervention working for people reliably at scale. And like Deming, in the middle is the zone of wishful thinking. And inside the zone of wishful thinking is practice. And our work over the last several years has been trying to help us get a handle on what it means to pay attention to practice and what it means to learn from practice. And in doing so, we coalesced what understanding we have to date in 6 principles that we'll talk a lot more about this evening, but they are these 6, being problem-centered, problem and user-centered, paying attention to variation, understanding the system that gives rise to things, paying attention to measurement, having shared disciplined inquiry, and organizing collectively in networks. As I said, for those of you who will come this evening, we'll talk a bunch more about these in some more detail. But what these things do, they help scaffold improvement by filling knowledge gaps. Typically in our work, all of us, we feel like what we're doing is trying to close the awareness-ignorance gap. Think about the last great thing you created, right? Mostly what we are all concerned with is that it worked, and we want to tell other people that it works. We want to identify quality ideas, and we want to do research to help us assess promise. These are important things to do. But in addition, we ought to be closing what Jeff Pfeffer and Bob Sutton call the knowing-doing gap. We ought to be thinking about how we perfect execution for know-how, how interventions change by context, and we need to understand for the things that we build what is necessary, a thing that we've come to call standard work, and what's sort of optional in various settings. When you do that, what you're trying to do is understand how to take the content of your science and innovation and match it to various contexts. These things happen because of work processes and participation structures. And when you create an equitable learning environment, you are really paying close attention to whether lots of people across context have access and the outcomes are the same, and that people across context have a voice in how things are done. And I think these, access, outcome, and catalyzing voice, are the 2 sort of broad shoulders, big arms of social justice. And so we really need to pay careful attention to things like that variation we talked about. We need to pay attention to the fact that, we need to pay attention to outcomes such that we hold ourselves accountable for similar, nearly the same outcomes across contexts. And we need to pay attention to the fact that local knowledge is important and local voice is important. Charles Payne wrote a wonderful paper, I think in 2008, talking about why we have so much reform, so little change. And part of the reason we believe that there has been so little change is that we haven't figured out good ways to pay attention to voice of those who are who should be a part of the interventions we're creating. So we think that inequity can be redressed through disciplined application of those 6 principles, and equity itself lives in the details of process and practice. So I want to give a few cases. In our book, one of the cases in our book is a case of Cincinnati Children's Hospital moving the needle on adolescent asthma. It was sort of fun to work on that case. My colleague, our colleague, Alicia Grinnell, and I interviewed several people at docs at Cincinnati Children's about this case. And seeing how they worked diligently on these problems, joint problems, of producing equality of outcome and respecting voice was really quite instructive. So there's no cure for asthma, as many people here probably know, but effective treatment exists. And in their hospital, they had well-established treatment protocols, but yet it failed to really support the needs of about a quarter of patients. So, gotta go back. So children returned to the hospital very frequently, and they observed that most of the children who returned to the hospital very frequently were children who had Medicaid insurance. And the thing that was really exciting about what they did in the main, when they learned this, they didn't say, oh, poor people don't have as much access, results for poor people are not as good. They didn't take that as an explanation. They took it as a place to begin exploration. And what they did was they started by trying to understand the system that helped produce what they saw. They saw that they assembled a diverse team of people who do hospital services, social services in the community, and members of the community themselves. And to make a very long story short, they understood that part of the problem was in the protocols that people use at patient intake. So for example, they knew that local environmental situations in homes, like the presence of pests, create asthma triggers. But when you have these doctors and other healthcare professionals sitting down with clients, and you ask that you don't kind of want to ask about these kind of questions, they're kind of embarrassing to ask about. So they created protocols that regularize, standardize patient intake. Another thing they found, some of the communities where some of their patients lived didn't have easy access to pharmacies. Did two things. One is they made information available to people about where you could go, but they also made sure when people left the hospital, they had medication with them. Why? Because if they did, you could see the impact the medication had, and you might be willing then to do the effort it took to get it. And they identified unsafe local environments, and then talked to landlords who were in control of them. So they were able to close a gap which felt intractable at the beginning by diligent attention to detail. A little bit about some of our work, moving the needle on developmental math in community colleges. When I say developmental math in community colleges, how many people here know what I'm talking about? So, one way to think about developmental math, it's that math, I probably have some of that here at the University of Wisconsin as well, is that math you take when you leave high school often, believing that you passed mathematics in high school, and you show up and you take an exam, and the institution you want to go to says, no, you need to take more math in order to be ready to be prepared to take college level mathematics. And this is important because taking college level mathematics is the gateway to many careers that people want to join. So 60 to 70% of community college students wind up being placed there. 80% of those students never get out with a college, prepared with a college credit in mathematics. So that's a whole lot of people who then effectively have opportunities shut down for them. The typical course of study is you have to have elementary algebra, intermediate algebra, and then you get to take college math, and you get a college math credit. The work of colleagues at the foundation, we created two new ways to and through developmental mathematics. One based on quantitative reasoning, the other based on statistics. So the spine of teaching developmental mathematics was wrapped around these two approaches. And we made it possible to not get lost in the switches, in the cracks. Sort of 1 year-long course. So if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. In addition to doing that, our colleagues at the Foundation, from looking at the problem, we attempted to come up with a practical theory that would guide our work in trying to address this developmental mathematics problem. So the goal was to change developmental mathematics as a gatekeeper. And we felt like it had, our analysis of the system helped us understand there are a bunch of parts in making that happen. Well, there's institutional structures, there's leadership attention, there's the instructional system, which we paid a lot of attention to that, sort of building new curricula, paying attention to the collaborative context of work among faculty, and to present ambitious learning goals to students. Students need to know how to work hard and how to persist. So a big part of this work was helping students develop a mindset that would get them through developmental mathematics. Developmental mathematics, most instruction today places huge language and literacy demands on learners that many learners aren't prepared to take up. So a strand of the work was trying to understand, to help students read more effectively and to help the language inside materials not to be such a barrier. And we worked on comprehensive programs of professional development to help faculty understand the underpinnings of teaching better and to help faculty leaders to become collaborators with us in improving curriculum. What did we see? So here you see a comparison of 1 year in Statway by comparison to 2 years in the standard sequence and the success rate. As you can see, that success rate, the 2-year success rate hovers around 14% for the standard way through, and students taking Statway were up around 50% success. So so you're getting far more success in less than half the time. And this happens when we have, as the number of students who are part of the program goes up. So we are able to maintain these results as scale increases. Further, when we look at some communities that have been challenged by courses like these, the results seem to maintain. So we are now serving more than 50 institutions, and the work has touched more than 20,000 students. And to be clear, this comes from paying attention to the details of practice, paying attention to the work that people do, and also trying to organize the work so people can work more effectively together. I want to move to talking about high school graduation rates. Some of you may know that there's really a revolution starting in this country of increasing graduation rates among students in urban areas. Some of it has been led by the Chicago Consortium on School Research, an institution that Tony Bright started many years ago in Chicago and continues to be a force for change in Chicago. And another place that it is occurring is at New Visions for Schools, an organization in New York City. I'll talk a little bit about what each of these organizations are doing, and in particular, from this perspective of paying attention diligently to detail. So the CCR story, the CCSR story. As early as 1996, the consortium knew that Chicago high schools, you might have been in that time, knew that Chicago high schools weren't doing such a great job. They knew things like some students came in relatively prepared to do well in high schools, and the high schools themselves didn't push them along. So they knew back in 1996 that consortium data and analysis were helping people understand that. There's a marvelous paper that Melissa Roderick, John Easton, and others from the consortium wrote detailing the history of consortium research. And they said in that paper, when the failure of high schools, I actually remember this, when the failure of high schools was made public through consortium data, it created a lot of attention in Chicago at the time. But they argued that at the time, what happened were, this is their term, there were big policy responses, right? So the mayor wanted to take over high schools, create new college preparatory curricula, had end of course exams, and predictably there was some local resistance inside schools when these things were delivered to them. Over time, the consortium moved its focus from what they referred to, what Easton and colleagues referred to as the big policy response, to local capacity building. They began to work more carefully on indicators of high school graduation. And one of the things that they found was that students who were successful on track for graduation in 9th grade almost always graduated. And there was little loss year over year. So they found that sort of an indicator of improvement really was very telling about who would be successful 4 years later. So they had a challenge to create data and frameworks that local educators could use in order to pay attention to on track, right? So they did one thing, they found a great indicator, but then they did another thing. They worked with educators to make on track intelligible for them. They focused on manageable problems. They helped educators see what things, more micro things, were correlated with having a successful 9th grade year. So in their language, they shifted their attention from big policy ways to approach this problem to capacity building and local organizational ways to work on this problem. And in their paper, they're pretty clear. They said, our goal was not to tell educators what to do. Our first goal was to help educators understand the relationship and then to work with them about how to make that relationship, how to use that relationship in their local context. Another high school graduation story comes from New Visions for Public Schools in New York City. New Visions works with 80 Department of Education schools and 7 charters in the city. And you can't read this unfortunately on the side. I apologize for that. They understood that, and their data told them, that there were sort of 5 wells of places they could work that could really have impact on graduation in New York City. So one is graduation planning. Another is paying attention to attendance. That's the second. The third is keep paying attention to credit. And a fourth is, I can't even read that myself. Marking period. And so paying attention to where they are in the marking period. And Regents test prep. So in New York has a very complicated sort of graduation from high school scene. There are multiple kinds of diplomas. There are both test requirements and credit requirements. And this is important because, as they explained to me, anybody can sit for a test. So you could sit for the world history test and you could pass that thing, but you could also never be advised to take the world history course and then get to year 4 and can't graduate. And these things are hidden in the morass of information. So they identified these things, tried to get their arms around the system. They engaged in collaborative planning and monitoring with local schools. And the thing that's really interesting, this approach didn't come from the mind's eye of academics. It came from practitioners in the New Vision schools. And it resulted in what they call the strategic data check-ins. And so they have, which are just regular routines, and they have strategic data check-ins on all these things. So they're routines and conversational protocols, common and shared tools. So all their work, for example, all their spreadsheets are in Google Sheets. And that's important because they say it's because the data are not delivered to schools. The data are both persistent and shared, so everyone has access to it. So they have common tools, and they specify the role groups that should be engaged in the strategic data check-in conversations. Just to review one of these the strategic data check-ins, so they review all students entering year 4 to establish the best case graduation plan. So, and they make it clear that it's not used as an accountability thing. They just want to know, given the school's view and the data, what's the best case scenario for each student? They determine what's mathematically possible, but what's also practically possible. In the constellation of students, they flag trouble spots. They create shared persistent records with these Google spreadsheets. And they conduct, at least the graduation strategic data check-in twice, once in the fall and once in the spring. And so they pay very careful attention to where students are and to techniques they can use that would identify who needs what kind of preparation. And they do similar kinds of things with their other family of routines, like the attendance routine and sort of the marking period routine and the credit accounting. So I'm going to take these examples plus where I started before and do what I think, what you might want to think of as a social justice crosswalk. Why do I refer to it as that? Because, you know, you could sort of take this whole idea of being user-centered or, you know, disciplined inquiry and say, well, I get that, but how do I understand that in the context of a problem of social justice? So if you attend to the right problem, for example, being user-centered, you may devote your effort to a problem that really has traction. We call these high leverage problems. So that really helps you pay attention to access and to outcome, for example. Local voice, you can't be user-centered unless you respect local knowledge. When you pay attention to variation, you're looking to see who is successful in various different places and trying to learn from that. And one of the things that we've argued in our work is that when you pay attention to variation, you develop insight into what are the main things that seem to give you traction. We call these standard work. And once you've established standard work protocols, you can then understand how it needs to vary place to place. I don't know if I have time to go through each of these. And I'm going to go to the discipline inquiry one in a second. But measurement. Oftentimes, those of us who care about issues of social justice do not own the problems of measurement. And it is absolutely clear to us that if you care about justice and equity, you have to own measurement. Because you get, if you do it in the way that we suggest, you get clarity on process, and you have conceptual clarity. And one of the things that the New Visions folks said to me when I was talking with them, when they do their strategic data check-ins, people see local day-to-day experience in the numbers. The numbers then get translated into actions that they see on the ground with individual students. I want to go quickly to give an example of how you do this discipline inquiry and you have developed common voice. So we're doing work with a school in Los Angeles where they were worrying about the problem of how to help students in the disciplines develop reference to text. When I say reference to text, do you know what that means? It's the skill that when you're reading complex text in science or social studies, questions, especially in the new Common Core assessment regimens, want to see you answer the questions by referring to the text. And in the school we were working with in Los Angeles, students did very poorly on reference to text. They weren't able to take things from the text and make it part of their answers. So they set a concrete goal that they wanted to have 70% of students score level 2 or better on this CREST Common Core assessment. Quickly, what they did were more than 40 PDSA cycles, plan, do, study, act cycles, around routines to sharpen how they help students do reference to text in their classroom instruction. These got organized in several ways, where you started with just one teacher and you had a routine, for example, that we co-wrote with them. And by the third wave, it was an entirely different routine that teachers made themselves. This picture, if you can, I'm not sure how well you see it in the back, here in the center is a group of teachers who are talking about their PDSA work, and arrayed around them is the rest of the faculty, listening to them report on their data and how they did the routines that they did on the problems they worked on. And what's key here is that everyone in the school is engaged in work like that, all focused on this one common problem of literacy. So you can see how, I'll go back to the table for a second. How a form of discipline inquiry allows you to produce public results that an entire faculty can share. And in doing so, the faculty develops a common language to talk about the problems that their students are facing. So to give enough time for at least a few questions, I'll sum up. So the argument I've been trying to make to you is that social justice, at least in part, lives in the crosswalk of systematic approaches and the details of practice. The responses to context, to real identified needs, and to broaden voice to include those who should participate in decision making. When you wrap all that up together, at least we come to the conclusion that it's really possible to engineer a kind of equity. And when that happens, many more people, individuals, benefit from the work of an intervention or an innovation. And that diversity supports reliability. When more and more people have voice in building the intervention, it kind of gets a robust quality about it. It starts to be a lot less breakable. So diversity supports reliability. And if you take nothing else away from our time together in this talk, is that I'd like you to noodle on the proposition that the work on social justice, a lot happens in the details of practice. Thank you. That's it. And I think we have time.
No, we have the question. We have about 10, 15 minutes. So.
Question for you about the
Well, that's a great question. And some of it happens by hanging around with students and experiencing what they experience. When we were doing the community college program, for example, one of the things that Tony did actually was there's a test that community college students take called the compass test that determines where you're going to be placed. Tony took the compass.
Yeah, I went to our local community college and I took the test.
You'll be glad to know I did get placed in college.
I mean, in our work in Los Angeles, we sit with students and see what they do with text. One of our students actually, in another effort, is his quality improvement team in this high school are a bunch of students.
In the community college work, when Louis was talking about these redesign of the curriculum, one of the first PDSA cycles, there was one lesson. We had a forum in which there were about 100 faculty, and 2 people agreed to teach this to a group of students who got bussed in for that day. All the faculty watched these other teachers, and then we broke faculty up into small groups with students, talking with them about the experience so they could get the students' perspective on the experience of this different kind of lesson that they were going through. So that was another case which was, the whole activity was deliberately designed so that not just us, but the faculty themselves could hear students' voices in terms of how they would relate to this form of instruction.
Other questions?
I guess I had a similar question building off of that about how families might be involved in these processes, especially if you think about our teaching force being predominantly white and middle class, and the idea of social justice being brought forward kind of by having diverse perspectives. It seems like you'd want to maybe go outside the confines of the school.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one way to think about it, though not the only way to think about this problem, is that in places where there has been a kind of shared authority with communities, one of the big impacts of that, right, I think it then creates a local appetite for processes that have traction. So when you have a social arrangement like local control, it provides an opening for activities, collaborative activities like these in communities and in particularly in families. So I think one way is to have policy and local arrangements that produce within communities an appetite for both participation in design, but also an appetite for both processes and innovations that appear to have traction.
I was really struck by the data from your community college example that showed the difference in instruction by the different populations. And in particular, it looked like the white students had a huge change, even compared to the other students. And I love that, those data, because when I do my own work with studying climate, we always say climate improvement for one group is climate improvement for all groups, and that's a great example of that. How have you used those data at all to talk about the changes, or, you know, it was just really striking to me, I guess. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we're always looking at we're always looking at variation in performance. In the case of the community college work, in terms of what we know about students, in terms of what we know about the classroom context they're in, and in terms of differences among the colleges, because there are multiple. Some of you might think this looks like a hierarchical linear model problem. There are multiple levels at which these activities are occurring, and each contributes to the outcome. So in this case here, we're looking at variation among students in terms of standard descriptive characteristics. Who's this working for? who is it not. And in the spirit of the continuous improvement, well, on average, 50% of the students are succeeding, where historically in 1 year only 5-6% do, and in 2 years 15% get there. Well, there's still 50% who are not. So the continuous improvement work is, in some sense, the original design solved one set of problems. It was a big advance. But now there's a more complicated set of problems trying to understand, well, what's going on with the other 50%? And it's not one thing. There are now multiple places where students are not succeeding. And so that's now driving the subsequent rounds of improvement work.
And the work is being spread to beyond this core, well, what started as a core group of 20 colleges. And part of what allows the work to spread and allows us to have conversations with new organizations are results like these, and both sides of the results are part of the conversation. The sort of the side of the results says, God, you're doing a whole lot better. But as Tony said, also, well, that's just a place to start, right? And sort of one of the big, I think, for me at least, one of the big mind shifts in doing work like this is that when you see results like those, you're ready to sort of tie a neat little bow around it and say, all right, on to the next problem. But if you adopt this stance, seeing results like that sort of asks you, well, what's going on with the other 49% of students, or the other 50%?
I'm trying to figure out how you would have this conversation with a group of people who are sold on fidelity of implementation, alignment, and scripted curriculum. Because that's what I'm seeing locally in a lot of the schools, is everybody is doing the same thing at the same time. And that's their best way to get the reliability they want.
Well, I think part of that conversation you can have with the results they get, which could use a lot of improvement. So part of the conversation is, I think, looking at the actual variation in the data for something like a standard scripted curriculum. I think part of the conversation is also in recognizing these techniques as a way to mine local knowledge, right? So our work at the UCLA Community School, where the school principal has been slowly adopting this improvement work as the way she runs part of her school. And I think a big part of it was that she recognizes it as a way to have better conversations with the people in her faculty and to have better ways to get from them what they know. And so I think that it's not a transformation that happens overnight. I think it's gradual. But I think part of what makes it a possible conversation to have is that chances are you can show that if you build an improvement infrastructure versus a sort of a standard impact infrastructure, Don Purick has this great blog on the WT Grant website where he talks about building infrastructures for improvement versus building infrastructures for impact, is that these kind of infrastructures will highlight for you local knowledge and will highlight for you variation and will highlight for you which problems you should focus on. So I think that's part of the answer to your question.
So who's the person you've got to turn to make that happen?
I think you have to turn multiple people.
Okay.
I think you have to turn people who have authority appropriate to the problem you want to solve, right? And I think you have to turn people at in the school sense, in the school leadership, but you also have to have allies on who do on-the-ground practice.
I
actually want to build off Beth's question. The intervention that you ended up doing in the New York schools,
Well, they did it. That was just
they did, sorry, ends up, it sounds like in that one, fidelity would be appropriate language. Like, once they got the solution, are we still looking for variation in context, or did you get, I mean, you also said at the very end that diversity leads to robustness because you figure it out in a way that's going to work for a diverse range of people. So then at that point, are you looking for fidelity?
Well, I can tell you what they said, and their goal, right, in especially in those strategic data check-ins, is to problem solve with local schools to figure out, well, what do these data mean here? So, for example, in their marking period discussion, I think it's marking period discussion, they do things like look across all teachers in large schools, which teachers are doing well with which students. And for the students that they're doing poorly with, they try to figure out why they're doing poorly, right? Sort of, and sometimes what they find is that they're doing poorly because of things that are going on in the classroom, but other times they find that they're doing poorly, for example, because of the situation of the period, like a period right after lunch. And so the point is the regularity comes in the discussion that you're having and the points you should hit in how you do the analysis. But their claim is that in school, from school to school to school, the reality of what that means and what you should do locally is going to be different. So it's not, so the regularity, the kind of standard work is in the conversational protocol around the data, but the result in the action you take is going to vary school to school.
Let's give Lewis a round of applause.